All right. Hello and welcome to Beneficial Insects, Know Your Garden Buddies, presented by Jackson County Library Services and the Jackson County Master Gardeners Program. I am Spencer. I am an adult services librarian here at JCLS. Just a final reminder to please keep yourself muted during the presentation to avoid distractions for the presenter. We will be using the chat function if you have questions, and then we'll share them at the end. I do want to start with our land acknowledgement, which is Jackson County Library Services acknowledges that its libraries are located within the traditional lands of the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians and the Modoc Nation, as well as the Shasta, Tacoma, and Lotgawa people, whose descendants are now identified as members of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. We take this moment to recognize the Indigenous people whose traditional lands are where the residents of Jackson County live today. JCLS is committed to fostering understanding, deep respect, and honor for Indigenous people, and we encourage you to learn more about the land you reside on. For more information, go to jcls.org/land. Lastly, I do want to share that the views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Jackson County Library Services. We always say that. I don't think there's anything super controversial here, but you never know, so just in case. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our presenter, Grace.
Hello, everyone. My name is Grace Florjancic. I am the Master Gardener Coordinator at Jackson County. Our office is the Southern Oregon Research and Extension Center off of Hanley Road. If you've been by, definitely stop by again. And if you haven't been, come check us out. Today, we're talking about our beneficial insects, how to attract them, and how can we protect them. If it wants to, there we go. So starting off with just some basics, what is an insect? Going back to some of that, if you remember from elementary school. And what are beneficial insects? And then most importantly, how do we protect them? So starting off with insects, if you remember your kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, insects are a class underneath arthropods. So arthropods have those spiders, lobsters, crabs, everything with that jointed limbs and exoskeleton, and there's more than 30 orders of insects, so many that we kind of can't cover, but I will highlight some of the ones that are really familiar to us gardeners. So what is an insect? They're going to have that jointed exoskeleton like arthropods have. They've got that head, thorax, abdomen sections, where their legs are connected to their thorax, and insects are the only arthropods that as adults have wings and fly. Not all of them will have wings in their adult stage, but they can. There's always exceptions to the rules in gardening. So the wings and the thorax, or the wings and the legs are going to attach to the thorax, and their head mostly have their mouth parts, eyes, antenna for sensory knowing where they are, and their abdomen's going to have a lot of their digestive tract in it. Starting off with some of their life cycle, it's kind of a little bit different. Most of us are familiar with the butterflies and caterpillars, starting off as an egg, going to the larva caterpillar, pupating in a chrysalis, and then emerging as an adult transformed. There also are another kind of track style, which is nymphs. So they just kind of look like a smaller version of that adult form. And I'm going to be using larva and nymph throughout this presentation. Some things like true bugs go through nymph stages and have different instars as they get larger. And some things like our butterflies and beetles and flies will go through larval stages. I need to know how they eat for this. If they're going to be beneficial to us, kind of a good clue. They're going to be eating something we want them to eat. So insects can have a lot of different types of mouths. Some are piercing, sucking. Some are going to be more lapping. And some are going to be those good munchers of chewing. On the top photo, we've got a beetle with those big jaw mandibles. In the middle, that's a true bug. It's got a nice little short needle-like mouth so it can get into all the little gaps that it needs to. And the bottom right one is a fly with a sponging mouth. So that's not really one you want to get a kiss from, for sure. So the kind of important ones we think about in the plant world are this piercing, sucking mouth part. It's going to have that long tube. It'll fold under their bellies when they're not using it. But when they are eating, if they're an herbivore eating plants, it'll leave behind this speckled damage and white kind of pattern on our leaves. They stick their little mouth in between the layers of the leaves and into those cells, and they drink out that chlorophyll. So our plant's not going to be able to photosynthesize anymore. It's going to be, depending on the number of pests you have, severe or minor. And if they're a carnivore, like this bottom photo is a minute pirate bug, they can, like a mosquito, pierce their prey and drink that nice smoothie of their insides. Sorry, this is a post-lunch talk, everyone. Hope you are not too squeamish with some bugs. And if they've got those big chewing jaws, if they're a plant pest, they're going to leave holes behind. And that's some good clues for us gardeners to know what we might be dealing with as a pest. If they're carnivore, I don't have a photo shown, but you can use your imagination to figure out how they would eat another insect. And we need to be mindful of a couple things, that the mouth part at the larval and juvenile stage, maybe as a nymph, can be different than what it is as an adult. One of the easiest things for us to kind of think about and more familiar is caterpillars and butterflies. Caterpillars have those chewing mouths that they'll eat leaves, that hungry caterpillar, where butterflies are going to have a proboscis, a more sucking mouth part to drink up nectar. So they can have different mouths at different life stages, and that's going to mean they're going to eat some different food at different life stages. There are some insects that in their juvenile stage, they're going to be carnivorous, and in their adult stage, they're going to be an herbivore. Or maybe they might not even have a mouth as an adult. Some of those orders I talked about, true bugs. Bug is a scientific word. Not all insects are bugs, but all bugs are insects. Now you have something that when your friend misspeaks, you can say, actually, that's an insect, not a bug. Get some fun, one-up them on it. When we look at insect orders, we start to see some of those patterns. Our true bugs are going to have a little triangle at the base of their neck, and their wings are going to fold over each other, and it'll kind of make an X pattern. Some exceptions are those aphids and cicadas. They're a little bit wonky. Always exceptions to the rules in gardening. Our beetles, Coloptera, they're going to have those hard outer shells. They're going to have chewing mouth parts, where the true bugs are all going to have piercing, sucking mouth parts. So if it's got a hard outer shell, that line straight down the back where those parts of the wing covers meet and chewing mouth parts, it's going to be a beetle, most likely. The one we're all familiar with and know and love are butterflies and moths. Photos of their adult stages, going to have those beautiful colored scaled wings, that proboscis to drink nectar and eat pollen. Our flies, they are going to have one set of wings, whereas the previous ones all have two sets of wings. And these ones have those big ol' eyes, big compound eyes. The one in the right-hand corner, upper right-hand corner, kind of looks like a bee, and we'll talk about that mimicry a little bit later. And our Hymenoptera are bees, wasps, and ants, all very related. They have skinny little waists, and they have stingers and chewing mouth parts, whereas flies have that sponging, really gross one you don't want to get too up close with. So that's a really quick, brief rundown of insects, and it'll all be important a little bit later on when we discuss some of the eating habits and habitat spaces for these guys. So an insect, yeah, okay, jointed, arthropod, exoskeleton, wings as an adult, but what really makes a beneficial insect? They're going to make more plants, either as a pollinator or a predator to help us get rid of those pests, make our plants survive. They've got their own beauty, some little funky dancing wasp at the bottom. And they do a lot of work in the garden for us for free. It's one of those things where gardening can be very difficult, laborious, time intensive. And if nature already has a method to get the garden working, might as well let nature do its thing. Our beneficial insects are going to be our good guys. There's a lot of predators. They will hunt down insects and eat them. So they're going to get rid of our pests for us, make our plants be healthier for longer. Some are parasitoids. So they will lay their eggs in other insects. Those eggs will hatch, eat on that host, and the cycle will continue. And of course, our most well known are pollinators, where they take pollen from one plant to another, lets that flower get fertilized, seeds and future generations of plants. Starting off with our predators. All of these different guys are going to be from different insect orders, have different mouth parts, but they're going to do something really important for us, and that's eating our pests. Starting with our hoverflies. This is the one that mimics bees. In its juvenile stage, it's a predator. It'll eat those pesky aphids, those mealybugs, those caterpillars. And then when it's an adult, it'll be a pollinator for us. So this is a dual purpose beneficial insect, even better for us. As adults and pollinators, they are just behind bees as the second most important pollinator worldwide. They do a lot of good work on our flowers. They're smaller than bees, oftentimes, and they like flowers that are small to kind of fit their mouth parts. Things that are cupped like brassicas, close together like asters, things that are a little pale in color, white, pale pink, pale yellow. That's what they're more attracted to. As adults, much more easy to identify than in their larval stage. Their larva is kind of something out of a horror movie. I feel like some Godzilla-esque monster. But here it's eating an aphid. So size comparison wise, flies aren't really that big. But compared to our pests like aphids and thrips, they are much larger than that. So they need to eat a lot of aphids to grow larger, develop, and pupate into adult flies and repeat the cycle. Our green and brown lacewings. These guys will kind of eat any and everything, including each other. In their larval stage, they are very hungry eaters. They'll eat anything from aphids, mealybugs, spider mite, leaf hoppers, caterpillar eggs, scale, thrip, whiteflies. And if they don't have enough of those garden pests to eat, they can eat each other. As adults, they don't really do much pollinating or eating. They kind of just hang out and reproduce. So trade-offs on which parts of the whole garden ecosystem they're going to serve. They have really distinct eggs. It's very difficult to identify an insect by its egg. Lacewings have eggs on top of little silken thread stalks. So if you do have lacewings in your garden and you want to see if they're reproducing and hanging around for a long time, checking for those eggs is going to be a key indicator, as well as ones in the larval stage. They look a lot like ladybugs, which are sometimes called aphid lions in that stage. And then on the bottom left is a pupa, which, again, something kind of out of a horror movie, I think a lot of these insects can look like. Our minute pirate bug. I always want to call it the minute pirate bug, but it's minute. You can see a photo of the size of this bug compared to a penny, and it is very, very small. You're not going to know you have this in your garden unless you're going out there with a magnifying glass, specifically looking for him. Like those green and brown lacewings, they eat a whole host of organisms: aphids, spider mites, whitefly, caterpillar, scale, thrip, corn borers, and just a host of different insect eggs. This bottom photo is a minute pirate. Parrots are what pirates have on their shoulder. This is a minute pirate bug eating an aphid, one of our big garden pests. So it kind of brings me joy to see all of our hungry predators eating aphids. They have a little bit of a color change, and their nymph stage is a little more yellow, orangey, and then their adults are kind of that black and white Oreo-esque looking pattern. It's going to be really hard to see these in our gardens. They are very, very small. You probably won't know they're there. But even at this really small size, they can consume about 100 aphids each day. Our damsel bugs. These guys are quite a bit bigger than our minute pirate bugs. They can eat some larger prey, like getting into caterpillars, as you can see in this bottom photo. Size scale wise, they can eat a lot larger prey, which is nice. And they're going to need a lot more food to sustain them. So some larger things, caterpillars, leaf hoppers. Their eggs are kind of nondescript, I would say, in comparison to those lacewing larvae that have a really nice, easy identifiable stalk. So it's hard to kind of go by egg and say, is this going to be a good insect or a bad insect most of the time? Generally best to leave the eggs and see, unless you are confident in that identification. But they have that nymph stage where they're going to be a hungry carnivore, and that adult stage where, again, a very hungry carnivore. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner, eating a stink bug, which stink bugs can get quite large. So that is nice to have a larger predator in our garden spaces. And our lady beetles, known for eating all of those pesky aphids, they'll also eat thrips and mealybug. And they are misnamed ladybugs. They're actually a beetle, something else you can point out to your friends. Their larvae, kind of like those lacewing larvae, have that shape of, I always think of it as aphid lion because that's what they're commonly called, as ladybug larvae. They can eat 400 aphids in a day. So compared to that smaller, minute pirate bug that was just 100 aphid a day, got 4 times that amount that needs to feed these lady beetles. As they pupate and develop, we've got a really cool photo of them here emerging outside of that pupal exoskeleton, moving into their final form, the finished lady beetle. Very exciting. And we have our soldier beetles. These ones, again, are a little larger, so they can eat things like caterpillars, other beetle larvae, grasshoppers, moths. And you have a really good image of an adult here being a pollinator, getting a little lost in the sauce, all of that pollen on his face. He looks like he's got a really good buffet. These guys are going to like a lot of brighter colored flowers. They're going to be attracted by that color and that mass production of pollen. Goldenrods are also a great flower for them to be attracted to. In their larval stage, they just kind of look like a nondescript grub. I kind of always thought when I was younger, all grubs are bad. Well, they're really hard to tell the difference between what they're going to turn into. Some are going to be good. Some maybe not quite so much. So being a little careful in our gardens with how we manage our unfriendly and potentially friendly insects is important. There's more predators than that, but those are kind of some of the main ones you might see in your garden. For our parasitoids, there's mostly flies and wasps. I'm not going to say there's only flies and wasps because nature finds a way. But starting with our tachnid fly, These little guys have crazy hairs on their body. We've seen some hairy flies before, but these ones, it looks kind of like spikes. They'll parasitize caterpillars, grasshoppers, and beetle larvae. And as an adult, they'll pollinate, which is really important to have flies as pollinators in those high elevations where it's a little colder and bees can't reach year round. In the bottom left-hand photo, there's about 5 white dots inside what looks like maybe a caterpillar or a beetle larvae. Those dots are the eggs of the tachinid fly. As those eggs hatch, they'll eat channels outside of that caterpillar or beetle larvae. And eventually, this is a photo of a caterpillar pupating, and that's the green chrysalis. And that white slimy bit outside is the fly larvae. So once they're ready, they'll emerge out of their host, pupate, and then turn into the adults. A very lovely process, very clean. We have a lot of different parasitoid wasps. They're going to look a little different than our unfriendly wasps. When I was younger and I saw a parasitoid wasp with this really long ovipositor coming out of that rear end, I thought that is one gnarly stinger and I don't want to get stung by that. They do have a stinger, but what you're mostly looking at is their ovipositor because they're going to be really particular about where they're laying their eggs so they can get them in the right spot so they can be parasites to caterpillars, beetle larvae, grasshoppers, even aphids, depending on the size of the wasp. Our unfriendly wasps that might be a little more damaging to us as humans if we get stung, they're not going to have that really long, thin ovipositor. As adults, they're also going to be pollinators, which is one of those crazy things where some people always say, like, oh, wasps, what are they good for? Pollinating. These white cocoons on this caterpillar in the top left photo, those are all wasps. Those eggs have been laid. They're going to munch around inside that caterpillar and emerge as larvae or adults. Beneath that caterpillar is a wasp smaller than those aphids. That wasp, she's going to lay her eggs inside those aphids. They're going to hatch, eat the inside of the aphid, and emerge. If you look closely at your aphids on your plants and you see some that are kind of a blackened gray color with holes in their abdomens, they've probably been parasitized. You probably won't see this wasp because it's very teeny, but you can check and see if that action is going on in your gardens by finding those mummified aphids. If you've got mummified aphids, you've got this parasitic wasp, and that is going to be a good system you've got going on. And then the right-hand side are 2 adult parasitic wasps. There's a lot of different species of parasitic wasp. They're kind of going to pick their favorites. So if you're looking to control any specific pest, like an aphid or a specific species of caterpillar, you're going to want to find a matching wasp that will target that pest. They're not really generalists, they're pretty specialized in what they want to target. One of the more amazing wasps, the trichogramma wasp, is so small that about 5 of these guys can fit on a pinhead. Or pin tip, I suppose. These are caterpillar eggs that these adult wasps are on. So instead of parasitizing an aphid or a caterpillar that's already hatched, they will parasitize the eggs themselves of other insects. Really teeny tiny. These ones you definitely will not know if you have in your garden. Moving on from our parasitic wasps and flies are our pollinators. We have so many organisms that do pollination. Butterflies, hummingbirds, bats, wasps, bees, moths, beetles, flies, kind of anything and everything. The wind, not an organism, but also does a lot of pollination. Anyone have a guess for who the first pollinators could have been? A hint is that these two flowers are magnolias. It was beetles. I mean, beetles. They evolved alongside magnolias before other pollinators were existing, really, even. So before bees and butterflies were around, beetles were around. And as trees were starting to develop flowers, some old genus of species, like old genus of trees like magnolias, had beetles that would come to their flowers, eat their pollen and nectar, and pollinate them. And there's still some plants that are pollinated by a beetle today. Beetles and flies kind of have two different groups that they are attracted to in flowers. Depending on the species of beetle and fly, they either really like sweet and fruity flowers, some of those nice paler white, yellow colored, bright colored flowers, or they kind of like the death and decay flowers, like the corpse flower, Jack in the Pulpit there. Some things that are going to be darker maroon, brown, mimicking meat, smelling like rot. Very, very cool if you get a chance to see a corpse flower, but quite stinky. Understandably so if they're trying to attract flies and beetles. Our hoverflies on the left really mimic bees. The pattern of those black and yellow stripes protects them from predators. But if you take a closer look, you'll see some key differences. Our flies are going to have a little bit shorter of antenna, a little bit larger eyes, and they're only going to have that one set of wings, whereas our bees are going to have two sets of wings. Eyes are going to be more proportional and a little spaced out. Oftentimes flies, it looks like their eyes are almost touching on their face. Bees are going to be a little offset to the side. And I think I already said larger antennae. So yeah, difference between bees and hoverflies. Also, if you just have a moment to sit and watch and observe how they're flying and pollinating, hoverflies get that name for hovering, but they also will fly backwards, and bees won't do that. Onto our bees. Our native bees are fantastic. Most of us think of the honeybee, but there are so many more species of native bee than there are European honeybee. They are going to do so much for pollination services of our native plants and work longer and harder than some of those honeybees. I love honey. I love honeybees, but our native bees are important too. In Oregon, we've got over 800 species of native bee. This number used to be about 600 5 years ago, but there's a group that have been doing a lot of identification of bees and trying to find different species and get a better idea of what's going on in our natural areas in Oregon. And now we're bumped up to 800 different species of bee. Most of our native bees are going to be solitary. They're not going to form those hives and colonies like our honeybees will. 70% will nest in the ground, which is surprising. I didn't know that bees nested in the ground for a long time. 30% are going to nest in tubes and tunnels like our mason bees, leafcutter bees. See this little guy here in one of those tubes, making his little home. And our butterflies, one of the ones that everyone loves a good butterfly flying around their garden. It just brings you so much joy. There's about 250,000 species of butterfly, and they've been around for a long time, about 50 million years. And if you thought that was a long time span, beetles have been around even longer. And butterflies are a really good indicator of ecosystem health. And some of that is tracking butterfly numbers and timing of the year. And we'll talk a little bit more about monarchs later. One of the key things that butterflies do that not every single pollinator does is in their larval stage caterpillars, they are really a key food source for our birds. So if we want to have our birds around hearing their songs in our gardens, we need to have caterpillars for them to be able to feed their young with. They're going to have good economic value pollinating. That's going to really help agriculture. And they really just make us happy in our gardens. Everyone loves seeing a good butterfly around. All of these pollinators are going to have very different needs in what they want for a plant. So we kind of need to match an appropriate plant that's going to have the right flower, shape, size, color for what our pollinators want. So when we're designing gardens, we kind of want to think about what pollinators do I really want to target in my design. For example, hummingbirds really like those reds, oranges, yellows. They like longer tube-shaped flowers so they can get their mouth in there and their long tongue to get to the nectar. Whereas I mentioned those hoverflies, like those smaller cup-shaped flowers that are bright. And our bumblebees kind of like to wander around larger flowers that they can get their bodies all into, get pollen all around. We're going to want flowers that have nice, attractive colors for our pollinators and also produce a lot of pollen and nectar. There are cultivars of flowers that are double flowered, so it just means there's more petals. So if you think of a marigold, most of the time those are sold as double flowered. They're big puff balls full of petals. But to get those extra petals, they've been bred and bred and bred to have more petals, and it's at the expense of those reproductive parts, so the pollen and the ovaries for making seeds. So being mindful what we have in our garden, what's going to be producing nectar, double flowered plants, probably going to be producing a lot less. And hitting those keystone plants, those trees and shrubs for our pollinators is going to be very important. Some of those bloom earlier in the year and are a really good food source once it warms up and our insects are moving. So kind of the key, it's great that there's all these different categories of beneficial insects, but how do we protect them? How do we provide for them? That's kind of the most important part of what we're talking about. So really, if we want them in their garden, we need to provide for their needs. They're going to need food, water, shelter, which is their habitat. If we make a space that has all of these things for the entire year, they will come to your garden. They will find a way. You can also purchase them. That is definitely an option. I do have some recommendations that you don't purchase lady beetles. Oftentimes, they are not a native species of lady beetle, and there are invasive species that outcompete our native lady beetles, making it so there's less food for our native ones, or it's harder for them to get that food. And if you do find lady beetles that are the native species, sometimes when they're for sale, they were poached from the wild. So those two reasons kind of make it less appealing to purchase lady beetles than some of our other beneficial insects. Lacewing larvae are great. They're going to be in their juvenile stage. They're not going to fly away from you yet. They're going to be on the plants that you put them on, eating those pests. Once they run out of that pest, they'll turn into adults. And if they don't have pests to keep that cycle feeding for future generations, they're not going to be able to stay long-term in your garden. So thinking about beneficial insects not as a cure or fix, more as a reducing the population. So that way you can keep them in your garden. You'll have low amounts of pests, but these beneficials will stick year after year after year. Minute pirate bugs, also for sale, great purchase. Parasitoid wasps, these can be really good if you've got a target specific species of pests that you're trying to get rid of. You can get that matching wasp that'll hit that specific species. There's a lot of sources that say what species of wasp is ideal for your situation. And then again, probably not the lady beetles. There's better options out there. So if we do provide that food to get these into our gardens, What food do we really need to be thinking about for our beneficial insects? Larval host plants are going to be very important, not only for our pollinators, but for some of our other beetles and bugs as well, that are going to be just kind of more, I guess, total approach to thinking about it. So our native plants and insects have lived together for thousands of years. They've grown alongside each other. They've evolved alongside each other. They've kind of got a balance of I'll eat a little bit of you, you'll build some defense, and then I won't be able to eat all of you. You'll still have a healthy population, and I'll still have a healthy population. So our native insects, a lot of them specialize in eating our native plants. So if they don't have any native plants, they won't have something to eat. And when they get really specialized, that's when they need a larval host plant. So when there's only one species that this insect will eat, maybe one genus that this insect will eat, that becomes a larval host plant. It's very important for the survival of those future generations to have these host plants around. One really good example is our native milkweeds. We've got 3 species native to the West Coast. There's a lot of species native throughout the United States. And they are really good for our monarchs. Our monarch caterpillars need these. When we are trying to be helpful and provide these native species for our native insects, if I go to the garden center and I say, can I buy a milkweed? They might have these native options, but they're probably also going to have a lot of non-native options. So that's where using the species name really comes in handy. So if I can do a little research before I go to the garden center and say, okay, these are the ones that I really want to look for. These are the ones that grow in my area. Then you'll be able to go and pick plants that are appropriate for the insects that are going to live in your area as well. Not only do milkweeds provide food for those beautiful monarch butterflies, but milkweed bugs eat the seeds of milkweeds. They'll eat some other plants as well, but one of their big hosts is milkweeds. So I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a larval host plant for milkweed bugs, but it is one of the main hosts. And then there's milkweed beetles that eat milkweed as well. Their life cycle is, eating the stems, the leaves, laying their eggs at the base of the milkweed. So they'll hatch in patches of milkweed and repeat the cycle. So if we plant these larval host plants, we're going to be able to support a lot of different species that are dependent on them. And milkweeds are a little toxic in their leaves, so not everything eats them, but a lot of things do come to them for pollen, and they have nice, pretty flowers. Our keystone species. So if anyone remembers Roman architecture, that keystone is the top of the arch that keeps that arch formed in place. If you remove that stone, it's all going to collapse. Similarly, our keystone species have a really important significance in our ecosystems. If we take these keystone species out of our ecosystems, there's not going to be enough food to support those insects, and then those insects supporting lizards, birds, snakes, things like that. So starting with our plants at the base of that food chain, going to impact everything higher up and larger. For our trees and shrubs, native willows, oaks, and cherries, those are going to be fantastic for our butterflies. On our more herbaceous side of things, sunflowers, asters, goldenrods, those are going to really support a lot of butterfly species. Oaks are really large trees. They have a lot of leaves, and they support about 300 different species of caterpillar. So you're going to get a lot of different species of butterflies surviving from one oak tree versus something like an invasive Bradford pear that supports one caterpillar species. So being mindful about what we plant, where we plant, and making sure that it's going to be something native to encourage our beneficial insects. Bees, they also need a lot of plants. Their larvae, when they're getting all their little chambers lined up, the adults will put in masses of pollen in there. So as those eggs hatch, they eat the pollen, and then they'll develop and emerge as bees. So they're going to need a lot of pollen, and kind of like the butterflies, there's keystone species of plants for bees. Those goldenrods, willows, asters, sunflowers, dual purpose, serving our bees and our butterflies. Blueberries, golden tops, fringed loosestrife, all very important to support different species of bee. Some of them are really particular, like our squash bee will only go to squash flowers. Being mindful that we're going to plant for generalists that don't really care what pollen they get, but also our specialists that really need that one plant to survive. They're going to need year-round food. Insects are hungry. Once it starts warming up, they're going to come out, emerge from their underground or cocoons, whatever they were hiding in over winter, and they're going to need food. They're going to need food from early spring to late fall. So they're going to need pollen from that amount of time. And if we have the plants and have those leafy plant materials and flowers for pollen and nectar from early spring to late fall, that means all of the herbivorous insects are fed. And that means there's food for the carnivorous insects because there will be high populations of the herbivorous insects. So in springtime, those maple trees and willow trees bloom really early. There's a maple in my neighbor's backyard, and I could hear above me those bees just humming, buzzing all around that maple tree when it was in bloom last week. They were really hungry because it's that time of year where they're emerging. They need to stock up on their pollen and food. So they need these early spring bloomers. There's some concern that if the bees and other insects emerge and there's nothing in bloom, the populations can take a really big hit because they can't go so long without having food right when they emerge from winter time. And then fall's also an important season, kind of like we think of bears getting fat ready for hibernation. If anyone knows Fat Bear Week, definitely a great one. Get to vote on some bears as they bulk up for winter. Insects will do something similar where they need to have all these proteins, the fat, those lipids stored up from that pollen and nectar for their overwintering season too. They need to survive a long time being kind of in a hibernated state. Some of our good key fall bloomers, asters and goldenrods. They look beautiful for us gardeners, and they're also going to provide a lot of pollen and nectar. So after we give the food, we need to be thinking about water too. They're going to need to be able to drink. A lot of our insects are going to get water from either the moisture in the leaves or moisture from the other insects they're eating. But some things like butterflies need a water source. They can't land directly on the water, so they do an action called puddling. If there's a muddy puddle, if you've been somewhere with a stream and it's maybe got some wet area, that see a lot of butterflies around that edge of the stream, they need a lot of salts and minerals for their reproduction to make some pheromones and to lay their eggs. So in your garden, if you've got an area you can leave a little bit muddy, maybe mix it with some salty sand or untreated wood ash, get some of those minerals and salts and keep it moist, and butterflies will really be thankful for that. Honeybees also can't land in water. They, as a colony bee with their hive, will take droplets of water back to their hive to kind of cool things off in high temperatures. So in this photo here, they're on the edge of, I guess, a dish, and then it's just straight water. So maybe this was like a bird bath. One thing that you can do in the garden that I've seen a lot of people do is have these little shallow trays with pebbles or sand in it as kind of a butterfly puddling station. And other animals are going to thank you for this too, like lizards, rodents. Not that if you're in like a urban area, might have rabbits rather than mice or something like that. I did see in our garden elsewhere a snake drinking out of one of these. So it was a gopher snake, so great for keeping some of those rodent populations down. So if we provide food and water, they're going to need somewhere to live. They're going to need habitat. A lot of the habitat will be those plants, those native plants. But there are some other things to consider. Mostly undisturbed ground. Sections that are not mulched, not covered with plant material, just kind of bare open ground. Like I had mentioned, 70% of our bees are ground nesting bees. They're going to need an easy way to dig their channels into the ground. That top photo on the left is a entrance to a ground nesting bee site. And then leaving the leaves, trying to reframe it as no longer being called leaf litter, thinking of it as leaf habitat. Leaves provide a lot of overwintering material for our insects. So they'll bury down into the leaf layer, wait for it to get warm enough, and then emerge. So if we sweep up all of these leaves and dispose of them, we're sweeping away a lot of our insects too. And that really can impact insect populations. So thinking of it more as a habitat. When caterpillars that overwinter come down, they'll make their cocoons and stay underneath this leaf litter. But with that being said, kind of messier garden style could be really good for pollinators, but we are in an area that is prone to fires. So being mindful of how we balance things that help nature without harming ourselves and our neighborhoods. So if possible, leave the leaves year round, fantastic. If not possible, move the leaves away from your house. If you just rake them into your garden bed a few feet away from the side of your house, those insects are still going to have that place for them to overwinter and emerge from in the springtime. Still going to have some good habitat there. If you can leave leaves year round, that's fantastic. They'll decompose and add nutrients back into your garden bed. If you can't, understandable, but wait until it's later in the spring for those insects to all emerge and come out. So can be early May, middle of May, sometime before fire danger really starts. So just waiting as long as you can before you do your spring cleanup. And then we have on that red ring closer to our house, I believe it's 3 feet. The first 3 feet around our house should be a hardscaped zone where nothing flammable should be. A lot of people do gravel or pavers, something like that, but you can consider maybe that's a good spot to have a bare ground patch for some of these ground nesting bees. Maybe I could put my butterfly puddling area around that area section of the zone I can't put any other plants in. So that's what they all need to be coming into our gardens, having this good space provided for them. But what are some things that are harming our bees and butterflies, wasps, all of our good guys? Commonly called the insect apocalypse. These are photos from one of my volunteers, Lynn. On the left-hand side is her windshield from 1955, 1965-ish, where when she was driving, windshield covered in insects after a couple hours. Whereas last year, drove for a little bit longer amount of time, there's only a handful of insects smashed onto her windshield. This is a big change just in one lifetime. Now, I am but a young baby, and I don't really remember a time when there were that many insects smashed on a car windshield. But what I do remember growing up is having so many fireflies in my neighborhood, in everyone's backyard, all around, being able to catch them, see them every summer night. And about 15, 20 years after those memories, there's barely any fireflies in the neighborhood. They're all in the wooded streamed areas. So it's kind of a shifting baseline where between Lynn and I, Lynn has memories of even more insects than I have memories. People younger than me will have even less memories of large insects. So it's easy enough to say, yeah, they kind of are less in my time. I've noticed a few less. But when we have generations of people saying, yeah, there's a few less insects, our baseline for what is considered normal amounts of insects really shifts. So it's hard to realize just how many compared to 500 years ago are left, or how few insects are left compared to that time frame. Our monarchs. Everyone loves our monarchs. They're such cool butterflies, one of the only insects that migrate. 2024 monarch count had 230,000 monarchs, which sounds like a lot, but it's really not. Last year, the monarch count had 100,000 more individuals. And compared to the 1980s, this is only 5% of the population left. And that's what, 40 years? We lost 95% of the monarch population in the Western monarch count. That's a huge decrease. So what's causing this insect apocalypse? A lot of it can be attributed to human influence, habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, sprawling suburbs, splits all of that native forest, grassland. When we landscape, we put in non-native plants because they're exotic and cool to us, but they're not helpful for our insects. Things like climate change, which has increasing droughts, different temperatures, so bloom times might be different on some plants. And then in agriculture, the way we grow our food, which feeds us, really doesn't feed our insects. Having the same crop planted over and over and over again, not providing a diversity of plants, will not provide a diversity of insect life. One of the big things is our pesticide use. A lot of people, from agriculture to homeowners, either improperly use their pesticides or overuse their pesticides. One of the key things to remember for pesticides is read the label before you use it. Read the label before you buy it, and then read the label before you use it, and then also again while you're mixing it up and about to spray. Just so you know all the ins and outs of, is there a certain time I should be using this? Is there a certain area I should not be using this? One human influence, something that had really good intentions, but doesn't always work out in our favor. Bee hotels, they are really cool, great idea, but there are some downsides if you're not doing it correctly. It is grouping a lot of different bees close together in one location. So if there's parasites and pests, all the bees are in one spot. If something happens, like a, I don't know, big storm and this bee hotel falls down, that's all the bees in one spot. They need to be cleaned yearly. A lot of people think, oh, I can just put it up and leave it and it'll take care of itself. It will not. If there are pests and parasites that get onto the bees inside all of those channels, they will stick around year after year, and then that'll infect more future generations of bees. So when done properly, they're great and fantastic. And there's a lot of people that really care for mason bees, leafcutter bees, anything that'll be a cavity nester. But if you're just kind of leaving it up to be neglected, maybe there's some more impactful things you can do, like spreading out native plants and having those nesting sites throughout your garden so they won't be all clustered together when the bees go to lay their eggs. Here's some photos of those parasites. There are mites that get on our bees. So when they are all in those larval channels, if there's mites hanging out at the entrance, as each individual bee leaves that channel, there's like 10 bees in there, they're all going to leave with a couple mites on them. And then that's just going to kind of repeat the cycle of increasing those parasites and pests on our bees. So being careful about how we're helping, and is this actually helping, or is there something else I could be doing that might be more impactful for my garden? And then on the side of pesticides, we've got this really big mentality of, I see a bug, I need to spray this bug. There's something on my leaf, it's bad, I need to get rid of it. I just listed a lot of different beneficial insects. If we spray those guys, they're not going to be able to do the work for us. Not everything we see is necessarily bad. A lot of them are neutral. They're just hanging out and living on a leaf. So before we go jumping immediately to a nuclear solution, taking a step to really identify, what am I looking at? What's going on? Is this a concern? What actions do I need to take? If we do need to spray, being mindful of what we're spraying. A lot of pesticides can be split into either broad spectrum or more specialized. A broad spectrum insecticide is going to kill a lot of different species. It's going to kill beetles, bugs, bees, a lot of different things, whereas something specialized might just target caterpillars, or it might just target true bugs, or something like that. So it kind of gives us more control that we're going to hit what we want to hit. And thinking about, is pesticide the right step action to take? Integrated pest management is a really good process where we really think about what else can we try first, starting with things that are going to cause the least environmental harm and trying those methods before we say, okay, this is not working, we need to use a spray. And thinking about the correct spray for this. So some things like pruning our plants, pruning out disease, proper watering, proper placement of plants, getting resistant cultivars. Those are all part of integrated pest management before we have to resort to a chemical spray. If we do need to spray, which it happens, being mindful of the time we spray. Bees are going to be really active from morning sun up to sundown. So if we need to spray in that time frame, maybe don't spray a flower, because that's when the bees will be visiting later on, and they can leave with those pesticides and either die or feed it to their young, where their young won't survive. If we are spraying something that's going to be broad spectrum, thinking about, okay, if I spray these caterpillars and then a mama bird comes and wants to feed her babies, she feeds them this caterpillar that I just sprayed. What is that going to do to her babies? So kind of thinking about it in a full food chain cycle of what's going to happen next. And we also, just one of the more important things is, what is my tolerance for imperfection in my garden? Is this an ornamental plant that I just like to look at, or is this a food crop that I want to live and thrive so I can feed my family? How, on the scale of important, is this plant to succeed? Thinking about it in those terms too really helps us decide, is this something I need to take action for? Or is it just kind of a spot that isn't going to spread, but is bothering me because it's not a pristine garden? That all being said, it can be very confusing to know what your next steps are. So here's my shameless plug. The Master Gardeners run a plant clinic at the extension office off of Hamley Road. There's walk-ins, emails, phone calls. We ask you questions about your problem and come up with an answer of what it is and provide you a list of some possible solutions for you to figure it out and manage your garden and have a more successful health outcome. So you don't have to resort to, I don't know what this is, I'm just going to buy the first spray I see and spray it. And that link there, the beeve.es, takes it to the website, and we've got some information of if you're going to send photos, how to take a good photo, when our hours are, things like that. It's a free resource for the community, and I really recommend it if you have questions about health issues of your plants. So really, what we need for a healthy garden to have these beneficial insects, we're going to need native forage for food year-round for these plants. They're going to need their water sources, some of that puddling action. They're going to need that habitat, which is mostly undisturbed shelter, and no pesticides, or being really, really particular with our pesticide use, making sure it's really appropriate for this situation. With that said, I have my sources, and thank you all for coming to listen to this talk. And I have a QR code here with a short, like 4 or 5 question survey that you can hover your phone over and let me know how I did. Would really appreciate it if you do that. And I also have time to answer any questions you have.
Thank you again, Grace. That was wonderful. I'm going to give people time to type in questions, but we did have one question at the beginning, so I wanted to revisit that one. And people were wanting to know if the slide deck would be available. I do know that we're recording this. It will be on the JCLS YouTube site, and I believe the Master Gardeners highlight that link somewhere as well. Do you share your slides? Do you prefer people just watch the recording? What's your preference there?
I can share the slides if you have emails of people who registered. That could be a way, or I can type my email in the chat and people can reach out.
If you wanted to type your email, that would be great, but I'm also more than happy to pass on the slides to attendees or anything else like that as well.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay.
Yes.
Oh, go ahead.
The aphid mummies. Yeah, they're really exciting to see. Good evidence that your garden is working the way you want it to.
While we're giving people time to type, I have a question, which is just, so I've noticed in my garden, there have been things that in their adult stages are of great benefit to the garden, but in their larval stages are eating my plants that I want to succeed. And obviously there's a balance there, like you said, of what's just me wanting it to be perfect versus what's actually damaging to something that's like a crop. But I guess my question is, how do you navigate things that in some stages are good and some stages maybe a little less good?
Yeah, that's a really good question, especially when we think about things like tomato hornworm. It's going to have a nice, pretty butterfly, but I want to eat my tomatoes. Some of it is how easy is it to move that individual and how many of those individuals are there. If I'm gardening in my veggie plot and there's just maybe 2 of those hornworm caterpillars, easy enough to pick them up, move them to another area, versus if there's 50 decimating all my crops, might be something that some further action needs to be taken of maybe there's a parasitoid wasp that'll really keep the population down this year. So then next year, there's only going to be a couple. Some different options on that scale of things of, is it a movable insect or is it something that's on a big scale that I just need to manage? And some of it is if you've got like an oak nearby or some wooded area, sometimes I'm guilty of not looking at what exactly that host is, but just moving it to an area where it's not my garden, but it'll have a better chance of surviving, or feeding something else if it doesn't have a host over there.
That's a good way to look at it. I've been moving slugs, and maybe that's a good approach for things in general.
Yeah, slugs are always a challenge. A lot of people do like a little tray with some beer to drown some slugs.
That makes sense. We have one more question in the chat. Do adult leps ever eat pollen? LEPS. I'm not sure.
Leps.
I'm not sure if that is a typo. Pete, if you're still with us, can you elaborate a little more?
Lepidoptera. Okay, yeah. Lepidoptera will... That's a good question. I know they are nectar feeders. I'm not sure if they actually eat the pollen or not. That's a very good question. I believe some at least do, because I think I remember reading that monarchs do consume pollen and that helps them with their migration flight.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions coming in, so I think we are about ready to wrap up. I just want to say thank you again, Grace, and to the Jackson County Master Gardeners.